Thank you so much for coming to this really important panel that I think is complementing a lot of what we've seen in the past 2 days. Because during a time like this, it is very important to talk about the role of generative AI in disinformation as well as extremism. And we know there is a lot of people here in the room that are coming from the business side and the startup side, and we do encourage people to really think about these issues when it comes to the business decisions that you make. We are very fortunate enough to have a great panel here today. We have a mix of academia, industry, and human rights law, which is a very exciting way to look at the issue. We do not have Adam Hadley here with us today, the founder of Tech Against Terrorism, because of the ongoing issues that are associated with this panel, so that just shows how urgent some of the matters are in terms of how we look at technology. Without further ado, let me introduce to you our esteemed speakers. So we have Broderick, that he is doing a PhD on the issue of jihadist terrorism as well as extremism on the right. And he is a fellow at King's College London Center on Radicalisation. We have Dina Hussain, who is the global head of Meta's counter-terrorism and dangerous organizations unit. And we have Rehan Assad from New York with us here today, who is a human rights lawyer at the Atlantic Council. So a very, very interesting panel, as I promised you. In the next hour, we will embark on a journey that delves into the current role of the technologies that we have today in extremism, in disinformation, both from non-state actors as well as terrorist groups. Today, we live in a world where GenAI empowers, unfortunately, individuals as well as organizations to create disinformation campaigns with unprecedented ease. What once required whole troll factories can now easily be done by using, for example, ChatGPT, as we are all aware. Just this year, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting on the threat of AI to global peace. Our discussion is, in this regard, structured into 3 parts. The first part, we will look at the role of terrorists and how they use GenAI. And the second part, we look at state actors and how they use GenAI and disinformation. And in the third part, we want to have a little bit of a hopeful note where we look at how can we use content moderation and GenAI to advance solutions, and how do we use international law, international human rights law, and other instruments to advance the issue and make strong and robust frameworks. Without further ado, let's delve into the first pressing issue, which is the role of terrorists and how are they using GenAI. So I'm going to ask the panel to start with Brody and tell us about how terrorists have used GenAI, how they are inspired by each other, and how we are anticipating future challenges in regards to extremism in GenAI.
Right, so I'll run through some examples that I've seen from my work, but I mean, at the broader level, I think there's 2 ways that GenAI is really shaping both extremism and disinformation. The first, you alluded to, it's scale and cost. It can be done at a much bigger scale and at much lower cost than we've ever seen before. And this is something we talk a lot about, content moderation at scale. This is something that keeps us up at night. The other side of it, though, is also making the content more immersive and much more interactive. So to give some examples to illustrate this, I'll jump into some of the stuff that both the far right is doing and then also the Salafi-Jihadist side of extremism. These are the 2 main groups that I focus on, but of course this is being used by actors across the ideological spectrum. The first one that I think is really significant and doesn't actually get enough attention is extremist gaming. We know that extremists are big on video games. We know that they use it to recruit, to form communities, to also spread their propaganda, and they implement this through a range of different channels, from in-game chats to Discord channels, right across the board. What GenAI actually allows them to do now is to go in and modify the code of certain games and change characters, change skins, change appearances, even in some cases change the layout of the game to make it more amenable to their purposes. We also see extremists using games in new ways and sometimes creating their own games. And so I think this is one of the things that we need to keep in mind. Gaming is often sidelined, even though it's a huge part of the tech business and a huge part of extremism. And I think that's only going to grow in the future. The other part of it is things like manifestos and music. There's a number of LLMs that allow extremists to either create nasheed or heavy metal songs or rap music. Right across the board, we see examples of this, and it is incredibly cheap, incredibly efficient to do, and also a powerful and fairly potent way to convey a message. We see this also with manifestos. I'm not sure if anybody has ever taken the time, I hope not, to read the manifestos that shooters put out, but they are often horrible. They're copy-pasted, they're thrown together, slapdash. But with tools like ChatGPT and others, particularly more unregulated ones, we see the ability for shooters to actually create a coherent, persuasive, meaningful text document, and this is something we shouldn't underestimate. And related to that is also accompanying extremist content or propaganda with interactive or illustrative videos and images. I've seen a lot of this in the last few months. I think with all of this, we're seeing experimentation. We haven't seen sort of widespread adoption across all groups yet, but we're seeing a lot of experimentation with things like Midjourney and Scenario, creating compelling visuals and audio to go along with what would previously have been a fairly boring audio message or an audio chat. And the last thing I want to highlight here is this seamless translation of videos. So oftentimes we'll see a Daesh video come out in Arabic, but there are folks in Bangladesh or India or Indonesia who perhaps want to access that content, and they've been limited in their ability to do so unless they read Quran and know some Arabic. What we now see is that with things like HeyGen, you can translate very, very closely and very, very quickly into 140 languages, share it all around. And this also translates into far right, which is becoming increasingly transnationalist. So you might have a group in Norway or in Sweden putting out content in their local language, and then that can be now picked up by groups in the US or Canada or UK. So that's a sort of broad overview of what kind of experimentation we're seeing. I'll let the other panelists talk about what they've seen and what we can do about it.
Yeah. I can jump in, and maybe Brody and I are going to be tag teaming a little on this, where Brody's going to be giving a few examples of what could possibly happen. And I think it's part of my role to talk through what are the safeguards that we can build in, what are the opportunities we have as well to use these tools for really positive mobilization. So one of the things, just for those of you who might not know me, my background is in studying radicalization trends and the utilization of new technology by extremist organizations. And so one of the things that Brody highlighted is it would be detrimental to us to imagine that terrorist actors are at the cutting edge of using this technology. They really aren't. There are some early adopters in the way that we see the mass public using these tools. And so I think one of the things that's going to be interesting within GenAI is the scale up of tools to the point that Brody had made earlier. What do these tools mean when they are in the public and scaling up what's already been created? But I think it's also going to be interesting to see the different organizations, how their goals align with these tools. So we were talking before the panel about the fact that for Salafi-Jihadist organizations, information is sacrosanct, and your ability to translate or your ability to be a vehicle for explaining ideology or text is really important. So I don't see AI playing the largest of roles within those spheres, but on the flip side, I think where we've seen the most interest and uptake is on the extreme right-wing side, where we know that it's not usually the ideology that's at the core of the mass content that's produced. It's reach and engagement that's at the most interesting portion of this dynamic. And so I think we might be seeing the uptake on the extreme right-wing side be a little faster. Now, having talked about a little bit of the possibility of threat here, I also want to situate us within a realistic expectation of the mass production of these tools is being built by folks that already understand the concept of trust and safety. And so at the very beginning point of feeding the models themselves, we have an opportunity here to set some baseline trends and baseline best practices to talk about how can we as an industry come together and talk about what are the mechanisms we can put into place to avoid the models being fed by something that we don't want to have in there, or the trust and safety policies in place that allow us to make sure that what the output is of the models, whether it be images or language or whatnot, also has a set of policies that will protect from abuse in some way. And I'm happy to go into detail about the different kinds of things that we're doing to practice this. But I also want to maybe talk a little about the protections we have in place. So as part of the work that my organization does, we have a lot of tools that have already been AI-based that we're using. And that really centers around upscaling and upskilling our trust and safety and our content moderation tools. And so when we're talking about, I know generative AI is at the core of what we're discussing, but AI in general, taking a step back around, the AI can identify novel AI technologies that are being produced as well. So that is something that we should be using and understanding that it's something to leverage. It's also really important to talk about the idea of how do we scale up content moderation to make sure that we're meeting this threat as well. And I'd love to go into a little bit more detail of that, but I'm going to hand it over.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. At Oxford, just returning to Oxford is always fun. But as a human rights lawyer, I do need to build upon some of the considerations that we had, but also flipping the question to not just the extremist organizations use the AI, but also states do use the AI and frame it as sort of a counter-terrorism initiative. And when it does, how it can be abused as well. In my family, I do have a tech enthusiast, so I don't approach this like AI as a bad thing, but also attending this conference summit in the past 2 days, but there are a lot of optimism, but I think there are cautions that has to be raised, and guardrails, standards, like these terms, they're not just terms, like we're just talking about like best practices, because corporations do mention best practices, but they don't practice what they preach. So I want to introduce that perspective as a human rights lawyer. But in addition to like more sort of like a tech side or corporation side, what we are seeing is that, countries like bad actors, malign actors, like China, for example, has created, using AI to create mass surveillance system within the society, and then kind of frame this as counterterrorism initiative. UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism has done this remarkable report in which she cautioned this. Some of you may know the case of FBI against Apple. Remember that? In that case, Apple was very much concerned that once you make an exception, there's a slippery slope of which becoming the rules and norms. So it's not just an exception. And the special rapporteur raises concern. If we're gonna say, oh, this is an exception, we create this opaque system for the state to use these new technologies to really surveil its population. And what it does is ultimately it ends up hurting the most marginalized community, human rights defenders, journalists, right? Obviously journalists, sometimes they go, oh, this is a radical journalist who's trying to topple so-and-so government. And those are the things that we need to be very careful when we use even the term terrorism or jihadist or extremism. Any person, could be considered as an extremist for a viewpoint. And we start to see this in some of the conflicts that emerged recently. And I think that kind of dehumanizing can have really devastating consequences against human rights defenders, activists, and so forth. So and I'm sure we'll get into more other issues, but I think the question needs to be framed a little bit broader.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this. And this brings me also to kind of the second question and the nuance that we have here. We obviously do not just have terrorists and non-state actors abuse this technology, but unfortunately also we have to address the role of states and actors such as Iran, Russia, China, as Ryan has mentioned already with China. How are they, what kind of practices are they having with the Gen AI use in terms of their governmental policies and foreign policy objectives? And it would be really interesting to again go through the panel and hear what your thoughts are on the use of Gen AI by states for malicious purposes and how you come across this in your work.
Sure. I'll just say two quick things on this. The first is that I think the risk here is multifaceted. So you can both have examples. I mean, right now, there are countless deepfake videos of Biden, Trump, Zelensky, Putin, all saying different things to influence the conversation in one way or another. And of course, there's a risk there that as these deepfakes become more and more convincing, you can see, markets move as a result of that, or perhaps even, conflict shift as a result of that. But there's also a flip side of that, which is, and we've seen some limited examples of this, but I would expect it to grow in the future, where you may have a far-right politician or ideologue who then comes out, or let's say they're caught on tape saying something extreme. And then they might come out and they might actually flip it around and say, no, that was generative AI, that's a deepfake, that didn't actually happen. So it's essentially an assault on what truth really means. And I think that's something to think through, not just the sort of proactive uses of it, but also the negative counteractive uses of it. And I also want to say, as part of this, AI is both the tool that is being used by state actors and extremists, but it's also what we can use to detect, identify, and eventually remove this content. So I think you have to look at it from both sides, right? There's a risk here, but there's also an opportunity as well.
I would very much echo what Brody is saying. I am humbled by the panel that I'm with. My expertise is specifically around extremist organizations. So state-on-state engagement with new technology is not novel to us. I'm not the expert in it, but I am sure that you've all looked at the multiple studies of deepfakes that we've had. And again, AI technology is not new. Artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence has been in place for many years, I would say over a decade plus. It's just the barrier to entry with things like ChatGPT have been lowered. But I think one of the things that Brody highlighted that is very worth us unpacking is as the threat mutates, so should your ability to track that evolve, and your trust and safety policies and your skilled enforcement tools should evolve. One of the things that we've seen immense success around is AI's ability to track and understand networks, engagement of networks, is incredibly useful to mitigating against these threats. And so keeping in mind that as this technology mutates, your ability to respond evolves with this mutation is incredibly important. I think you're not going to ever be able to stop the uptake of new technologies by actors, whether state actors or non-state actors. But I think the focus here really needs to be on what are the safeguards that you can put into place. Now, I would say malicious or maligned intent within these tools is something that you need to keep in mind as you're building the tool itself. And from my perspective, the teams that I have seen working on this have been red teaming around this exact issue for years now. So looking at inauthentic actors or extremist actors, it's really important to be red teaming around these tools to make sure you understand them. And honestly, I would say the largest industry participants are doing that. And are cautious in their rollout of these tools because they are trying to build in these safety approaches into place.
Yeah, as our society becoming increasingly more polarized, I think truth-seeking became ever more important. No matter the Twitters, or now known as X, frame it as like this should be your source of information. Absolutely not. X is not your source of information, not opinion of others or some bots that you're going to receive your the legitimacy. That shouldn't be the legitimacy of the source, but rather I think we ever need journalists doing investigative journalism to provide us with truth, but at the same time we need to look at the information from different sources to come up and shape our own opinion as to what is real news in the human rights world. That what we're seeing right now is that often activists or impacted communities or victims, they don't have avenue to seek justice. Like the ways in which we talk about human rights, international law, it hasn't been really utilized in particularly against victims where the state has too much power or state hasn't signed on to international treaties of obligations. Maybe some avenues of justice were available to, let's say, Ukrainians. That wasn't the case for the Uyghurs in China, and Palestinians argue the same. So in that case, what we're seeing is that authoritarian states really deploy massive disinformation. So we start to evolve from this traditional form of disinformation. Like in China, we saw a lot of this kind of like, the state using people to say that everything is normal, or the state uses trollers, or like, these trolls, or they use bots, or oftentimes it's like state paid employees to be very active on social media. Although Twitter, Meta, and as well as YouTube, they're all, including Google, is banned in China. And Iran's is the same thing. But these state actors or state officials are incredibly proactive in China, in overseas, in the West, engaging with users to spread different kind of narrative as to human rights crises or atrocities. So, and I think for me, with the rise of synthetic media, what I'm really concerned is that your impacted communities, you don't have the resources that the state does. State has so much resources available. They have the money, they have the power, they have everything. And if they spread disinformation, it's very impossible for civil society like us to compete with that. That's where we really need the support of tech companies, and as well as many of you, to deploy tools that are we well thought through. Like, even if we say that maybe artificial intelligence can be used efficiently or principally to counter disinformation, even that statement has to be verified, that we have to make sure that there are standards in place that it does that. It's proven. It's not just something that we're eager to deploy. So I think we are, in terms of disinformation, I am worried about the capability and the size of, the scale of what could happen, because we haven't really seen how much capable the state, once they really utilize these instruments. I think we start to see a little bit of that in this conflict in the Middle East, where both the state of Israel and as well as I think some argue that Hamas use it as well. And it's very difficult to know what is happening. But what does happen is that the outrage that people feel over Twitter, and that's when the dehumanization against the entire population start to happen. So I think I would say that those are the things that we need to be very careful about, the potential consequences and implications against the marginalized population.
I might just
Yeah,
jump
of
in to
course,
add one
please,
thing. I think the challenges with new technology are operating from a place of ignorance. I think one of the issues that we face is a lot of times when new technology comes into the sphere, you see sophisticated actors, state actors, or large-scale industry partners taking advantage of the tools first. And then it takes us some time for the mass public to understand the intricacies of these tools, and then to understand putting the mitigations into place. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important is these tools need to be understood, studied and researched in a way that allows the mass public to understand the parameters of it. Because I worry that working with it from a place of ignorance to these tools gives them more of a power and an impact than they might have. LLM tools, at the end of the day, make connections between words. And I need to sort of pull us back to the actual capabilities of these tools. In a mass scale, they can be used to have much larger impact. But through things like allowing for research partnerships and creating the types of forums to understand the capabilities here, that I think is important. Bringing researchers together with organizations like my own company and others, and then also practicing the approaches that I mentioned, like red teaming. For example, on our side, we've been red teaming these tools for years now, and we've been doing it both internally and externally. What that does is it starts to disseminate a level understanding of the actual parameters and capabilities of these tools. Because I just worry that if we start to approach this technology from a place of ignorance, we imbue it with more power than it does have, meaning that secondary and tertiary impact, we're not engaging at a level playing field.
Can I get a two-finger on Rayhan's point as well? I just want to highlight an issue that we've seen in the last few years that's increasingly common, and it worries me a lot. You talked about governments essentially identifying or labeling political opponents as extremists. And this is a huge issue, particularly in Southeast Asia right now. And we actually see a number of trust and safety teams there being targeted by certain governments. And it presents a real challenge for both researchers and practitioners in terms of how can they do their job if they're being directed to take down content, which may just be legitimate political dissent, but then being labeled as extremist content. One avenue to perhaps go forward with this would be what Tech Against Terrorism does, and it's unfortunate that Adam can't be here, but there needs to be robust frameworks for identifying extremist content. So what Tech Against Terrorism does with their TCAP platform is actually to look at groups and remove or flag content from groups which are independently designated by multiple different governments and multilateral organizations. So it's not just one government saying that this political party or this political movement, which they don't like, is an extremist or terrorist group. It has to be a sort of broad, collective, comprehensive approach to identifying which groups actually are prescribed or designated and which are, legitimate political dissenters. I don't have all the answers in terms of how we can do that and how we can persuade governments to do this, but I think it's a huge issue that we're going to see a lot more of going forward.
Just one quick comment on that, when Twitter said the community notes is a great way to counter this, where we're empowering the users to engage with the source of information and tell us what do they think. But there is a fundamental problem. I noticed this happened a couple of times. I think many people who are very passionately engaged on Twitter and social media and they do, they don't just sit. It's just Wikipedia users, everybody wants to engage. And when they see an information that's just flat out false, they do engage. But at the same time, what we're also seeing, when the state also starts to utilizing that. For example, if somebody says, well, there is an ongoing crimes against humanity in China, but then Chinese government starts to deploy tons of bots, and they start to say, well, this is false. Look at all the people who are living happily. So the community notes become this is false information. And it's terribly damaging.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think you have already touched upon it, all of you, but I do want to focus a bit more on really what do you think the specific role of tech companies should be in this? And I know you highlighted already some of the efforts, red teams, etc. But I think it is very interesting to, if you have any kind of projects you want to really bring out and say, okay, we've been doing that, or we see this kind of specific tech to be something that could help us combat. If you could comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So I think we've been working with AI now for many years. I think in looking at the number of tools, we've released more than, I think we've over hundreds of tools that include AI in some way, shape, or form. And it's been you've all been using them in one way or another. And I think there is something around building out forums for engagement. So I think if you look at it, it's a three-pronged approach. You need to work on collectively transparency and working with partners in a really sort of conductive way. I think the second part is building in trust and safety mechanisms into these tools themselves. And then the final part of it is continuing to iterate from a place of trying to learn and understand and sharing out that knowledge. So forums for collaboration, trust and safety infrastructure, and continued understanding of these tools. And from our perspective, I can talk a little about what we've done. We hit our 10-year anniversary of founding the Foundational AI Research Lab. So we've been doing this for quite some time. I've mentioned this many times, but I think it bears repeating. Companies are not always going to be the authority on these tools, because companies that are not as large as Meta might not have the ability to hire a human rights expert, a counter-terrorism expert. And so finding out forums where we can share our baseline best practices is incredibly important. And I think at the end of the day, we can't hide from this. We need a collective global baseline best practices approach, which I think, again, industry leaders, Meta and others are really trying to get to that. I think that the point that we are making is that the question when I was having this conversation with a colleague before we sat down is, how do you ensure that these practices and these best practices and regulatory approaches are of a global norms standard and don't just reflect the norms and standards of one portion of the world, and also avoid the intricacies of political influence and different labelings of terrorism and the taxonomy. So sharing out best practices, increasing your investment in research, and continuing to iterate on your learnings. And that, I think, is where the investment is best placed.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really interesting if we have, Rayan, your opinion as a human rights lawyer on what is your ideal vision on what role tech companies should play. Do you think that this is a good approach? Would you add anything?
As I mentioned, I come to this, there are really positive advantages of tech that tech companies could deploy. Earlier we mentioned how disinformation can be used as a weapon of war, but recently we also started to see that how Syrian activists use the artificial intelligence and its mass capability to find more evidence of war crimes that took place, under the Syrian regime. So there are a lot of positive things that tech could do if there is a genuine will to engage with all these emerging technologies to shape our world by incorporating human rights standards. And that's something that's very much lacking. Another thing is that just because something has the human capacity doesn't make it a human. And another example that I could give is that recently, because the tech companies came with a lot of criticism by the Meta, Twitter, YouTube, everybody, for allowing a lot of this harmful content on their social media platform, where mass atrocities occurred, or people's, there's a lot of concern about mental health issues that users have raised. There is this desire to overly moderate everything so that we don't need to be held accountable. For example, they start to remove a lot of something that they would consider, oh, this is harmful, this seems like a violent video, we're not gonna let it see. But it turns out those are evidence of war crimes. And artificial intelligence, despite it is human-like capacity, it is not human. If we have a common sense. If you see something, you could say, well, this looks like a piece of evidence that could be used in a war crime tribunal or international criminal court. Let me actually submit this to the relevant authorities. But AI doesn't do that. And those are the nuances that we first and foremost need to understand. But even if artificial intelligence does give us this capability, there has to be human review. It cannot be we can just solely rely on this. There was recently some research that did a really good job on using the artificial intelligence to look at how much forced labor exploited in China, and they were able to find mass companies than any journalists who have gone to the region, but also they also corroborated with the journalistic investigation. So that's two. And in terms of what companies can do, I'll say this. Increasingly, we're seeing litigations against corporations, especially social media companies, for allowing their platform, where either the case against YouTube for ISIS harmed terrorist attack, or the Rohingya community, which is a very marginalized community, and how a lot of harmful content or dehumanization led to the mass atrocities are being committed. I would start with, and I think, Dina, you raise a really good point, that although many companies cannot have human rights experts, first and foremost, you have to have a human rights team within your organization. When Elon Musk took over X, the first thing he did is firing the entire human rights team. That's not the right approach to these issues that are continuously emerging. And companies cannot just hide behind the Communication Decency Act and say, I'm not a public forum, don't hold me to account. Users want to engage. There is an obligation owed to users, but also to collective our humanity. Tech companies increasingly becoming powerful, and that's why we're seeing from the left, politicians are deeply concerned about tech's rising power. But at the same time, tech companies don't want to have this, but they are also a bit concerned that having too much power. This is where I feel like public and private partnership is necessary for government and tech companies to talk, engage. But most importantly, I think we need to really look at what does the international law say about this. The UN Special Rapporteur, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights raised this issue of social media companies and their roles. I would highly suggest everybody to make sure that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, these are norms have to be incorporated into all these social media companies, not only just a mission, but day-to-day practice.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that point, I think, for example, what I'm researching is how can we apply international criminal law and international standards, as you've mentioned, and I think it is also in favor for the tech companies and for the social media companies to say, okay, we have this out there, we have courts, we have laws that are restricting us on how much we can incite and aid and abet international crimes, and I think that it is really important, like Meta is doing and like X was doing before there was some changes in the company, to say, okay, we are under obligations, under international criminal law, under international humanitarian law, and even if there is no court case, we see ourselves and our practice is bound by it. I think that's a really important step forward.
I will on that point maybe touch on something that you highlighted. So some of you who know me know this. I was trained also in international law. My specialization was counter-terrorism within international law. And I've worked for governments before that. So I worked in research, I worked for governments, and I worked for civil society, sort of a master of none kind of talent. But one of the challenges of what you are both highlighting is response time from international bodies. It just takes a very long time.
Yeah.
It is the same thing that we're talking about in terms of what Brody was highlighting in terms of taxonomies, getting a government alignment on what is a terrorist entity. I've taught terrorism 101. That's the first thing you talk about. Very difficult to get alignment. When it comes to new technologies, international bodies are not currently equipped to turn around recommendations quickly enough to catch up with the rate at which these technologies are developing. That is a core chasm that we need to address. And whether it is training, and this is what I was talking about, making recommendations from a place of knowledge does not put us in the place of fear and making recommendations from the ignorance of what these tools can do. And the best recommendations I've gotten is when international organizations partner with researchers, AI experts, and really bring that knowledge in. But I think we need to push to move a little in terms of understanding and response time here, because you both are the experts here. The amount of time that we get a paper to come out from when we partner up with international bodies, it usually will take about a year from bringing folks together to getting the paper together to getting the approvals. So there might need to be a forum that brings together, exactly to your point, civil society, industry, and government partners that offers a faster way to respond here.
Thank you.
I don't know how to do that yet.
Thank you too. Yeah, good.
I want to touch on that. I think there's a few things I would say. We've seen this before as well, right? This is not an entirely new cycle. So with Web 2.0, with social media, we saw extremist actors not on the cutting edge, but experimenting and then sort of opportunistically adopting these platforms and using them. And it took some time for regulation and technical solutions to catch up to that. So I think in the long term, I'm optimistic, but in the short to medium term, I think we need to think very carefully about how to speed that up. And to Rehan's point about this, it really is, at the end of the day, all technology is human, and we need human experts in those teams that are working on it. So that means more red teaming, more blue teaming. It also means more investment in trust and safety teams, even in an era of, tight fiscal maneuvering. So I think that can't be avoided. The other piece of it that I would say for any smaller platforms or smaller companies out there is you don't always have to do this yourself. So there are some great organizations. I mean, you talked about conveners. Some that you would think about are things like GIFCT, which actually does a lot of this already, and then Tech Against Terrorism also does some mentoring. So if you don't have a big in-house team, there are resources available to help you sort of facilitate that.
Agreed. Yeah. And just for those who might not know, the GIFCT is the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. You can find it there, and Tech Against Terrorism as well as an excellent source. I'm putting a plug because we are the chair this year. So if you need any support, I'm happy to directly you to their resources as well.
Yeah, I would just one quick something that just because like recent several cases, especially in the US litigation cases, where at least companies are safe in terms of aiding and abetting these atrocity crimes through the social media, doesn't mean that the case law is settled on this issue. It's a very much evolving, at least from the US perspective. The judges wrestled with the idea of like how much aiding and abetting, like are we talking about corporations like, whether social media platforms very willfully engaging and conspiring with terrorists? In that regard, like no, but I can also imagine that any sort of vague, willful negligence, when companies know these atrocities are taking place, if they don't take proactive action, maybe it's not the US court, it could be another court, or it could be international court. So I just caution that just, not only just big company, multinational companies, but us as individuals, because there's something called individual responsibility too, not just corporations, but how do we create an environment where marginalized communities don't have to face these legal battles, and I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to say, I think we have some hopeful notes here. So we know the way forward. We know we need some mechanisms where we can work together. We have some existing ones, and I think there is definitely still a lot of future hope there for collaboration. Thank you so much. We will move to questions now. I can imagine there's a couple of questions and not so much time. So let's start. Do you want to start?
Thank you very much.
1 second, sorry, I was asked to wait for the microphone because online it's not, can't hear it. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, should I go first? Or?
Yeah, go first. It's fine.
Sorry. Okay, cool. And so, hi. That was very interesting talk. And I'm a student from Cambridge University. I'm studying journalism and sociology. So obviously, you mentioned like international criminal laws, which I guess could be regarded as sort of like universal guidelines in terms how the tech companies should tackle disinformation and extremism, to the countries worldwide. So I'm just wondering. Because obviously I'm not coming from law background, so I'm just wondering, would there be a problem that the international criminal laws being too general, that it cannot properly fit into the speciality of each jurisdiction? So how would you deal with that if that's the case?
Yeah, for example, one of the sort of pitfalls of Nuremberg trial at the time was not imposing more corporate accountability, because during that time only few corporations were held to account. So, but increasingly after the international community and global community started to set up these international treaties so that we can bound by it, there was this discussion about, should we prohibit propaganda, and what kind of propaganda are we talking about? Because there is a free speech, freedom of expression implications. People are allowed to have egregious ideas, but that is their personal ideas, and we're not gonna infringe on their right to free thoughts and free expression. Especially in the US, there was this wrestling with this idea, but ultimately the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, there is sort of a general prohibition. If you incite violence against population, especially racial and ethnic groups, there is a crime, but then it follows with the second provision, which is the right to free speech and freedom of expression. So we need to juxtapose two these provisions together. And in the US, so far, in the US, first, whenever you sign onto international treaties, you need to also adopt it in the US legislation. So far, we're much more limited to non-interference principles So that means that I think it's like, for example, election interference. If the government, a malign actor, use propaganda to intervene an ongoing election, should they hold accountable? So those are the discussions that we're having right now. But that doesn't mean that there is, because at the end of the day, there's a privacy, the right to privacy, the right to free speech. These are just fundamental principles that enshrine. But ultimately what we come down to is that, are we inciting violence against marginalized community or population? And that is something that international law still prohibits. So while it is a general, there are specific efforts, and this is why I think, where I personally believe that there has been national efforts to counter that. Because what I really worry is that countries like China and Russia, like even if there is a genuine dissent against the government, that would be categorized as hate speech. It's a hate speech, or, oh, these are the people trying to topple my government.
Sorry,
And that kind of broad exception.
Sorry, yeah, we need to move. We only have 6 minutes left, so sorry. There's so much to talk about, so we'll just.
Can I just, while we're finding the next question, I'm just going to point out that I think when you're talking to from our perspective to social media companies, look into the laws and then think about how they apply to content. That is going to be a really interesting thing to look at, because laws are usually not drafted to address content or behavior on these platforms. And I don't think we need to pivot to becoming that granular, but I think, again, the solution here is forums that address best practices, because international law, especially international criminal law, rightly so, needs to be general enough to capture a multitude of abuses, but it is challenging to apply that to a piece of content. That's
Yeah, that's funny. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I really appreciate it. I wanted to raise the ugly phrase national security. If you take, for example, the Council of Europe's Committee on Artificial Intelligence Draft Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence, Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law, you will find that it preserves the carve-outs, if I can use that phrase, in domestic and international law for national security and defence. How can we preserve those carve-outs and at the same time deal with a global, let's say, or even a regional best practice governance regime addressing counter-terrorism? Because it seems to me that national security is going to be the best trump card that any state is going to be able to deploy in those circumstances. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
So I think I can take this very lightly, but I'd love to hear my colleagues' recommendations here. Content generated by generative AI is still content. You can still apply your content moderation policies to the content created. From our perspective, for example, we've got an entire designations process that takes into account input from different governments, but is not wholly or solely dependent on one government's dictation of what is extremism or what is terrorism. We take into account all of the different legislations and all of the different designation lists, but it is also a matter of looking at the content itself and applying that kind of filtering. I think at the same time, if you are building and training these models to identify inquiries that are going to cause the outcome to be dangerous or would violate any normal terms of service, you should not be allowed to post. I have personally taken down content that's like how to build a bomb in the kitchen of your mom. We all know this video, and it is something that we remove. And so if the equivalent information is being released by a model, and you have the correct trust and safety terms of service and content moderation rules in place, I don't want us to come from a place of fear to think this is going to be completely new, because the content itself should still be governed and addressed by policies that have already been built to take into account national security. Now, that's one portion of your question. The other portion of your question is regional versus international jurisdictional nexuses. And I think that's a question for Iran.
Yeah, I would very worry, and I think we're already seeing it, this over expensive interpretation of national security. Anything, maybe like, insurgent potential groups' dissent against the government is considered to be a national security issue. It's so easy to regulate it. Like, countries always introduce emergency laws under the national security. And that's where I highly recommend everybody, and I think that potentially as a guidelines, to look at the Special Rapporteur on counter-terrorism, and she addresses the national security interpretation of it too.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, so maybe right next to, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting panel. I had a bunch of questions, but I'll keep it to one. I think we're talking a lot about Meta, TikTok, the sort of US-based giants. My fear is that the more regulations they put in place, the kind of global market of social media companies means that we're shifting the most dangerous content onto Telegram, VC, headquartered in countries that don't play by the rules. So how do we develop international standards and enforce global norms for kind of more nefarious platforms?
Oh, this is one that Adam Hadley would have loved to answer.
This is a good question. I'll take a stab at it, then I'm sure Dino will have something to say.
You're the modem for Adam, no pressure.
I think it's a huge issue. However, there is some positive spots there. So there's some recent research to show that moving them or deplatforming them from mainstream platforms to these alt-tech platforms does actually disrupt both the leadership and the followers of it. So there is reason to do it. Now, how we bring an organization which is headquartered in 6 different cities, or a government that doesn't recognize, sort of international norms, that's an open question, and I don't think we have a full answer. However, I will say, the more that we talk about it, you do see slight incremental improvements and more transparency in the data that companies like Telegram are putting out there. So I think there's some room for optimism, and there's a lot of room for growth.
I think I will jump in very quickly to just highlight. Brody mentioned that disrupting the main dissemination nodes is effective. So Nico Pruha and partners have written about the different versions of platforms and how they're used. You've got beaconing organizations, documentation organization, dissemination platforms, not organizations. And different platforms are used for different purposes. Large-scale social media platforms are where these organizations go to beacon out that message. So utilizing that theory, disrupting that large-scale messaging process is part of the efficient approach here. The second portion of this is to understand that most of the players that are part of GIFCT or engage with Tech Against Terrorism are coming to the table with good intent, and we need to make the carrot more attractive than the stick. Because I think some platforms want to be that platform that the nefarious actors go to. And there is no level of law enforcement intervention that will change that malicious intent. So collaboration amongst the carrot portion of things needs to really be facilitated in order to make sure that it's your mom's not going to be using Telegram, or at least my mom. My mom barely uses WhatsApp, so like I'll say. But the barrier to entry for those nefarious platforms is still considerably high for the normative user. So collective engagement at the beaconing level, at the sort of more the areas where there's ease of access is an effective barrier. Now, the one thing I will highlight is if people are actively searching for this content, the solution isn't just going to be an online solution. If you are addressing an offline problem, you have to have offline and online engagement around it. And if you are trying to find this content on nefarious platforms and you have the sophistication to go to these dark web, like hyper niche platforms, the solution is not just going to be online.
Thank you so much. This was very fascinating. I think there is lots of hope, lots of worries, and lots to work on. So thank you for coming.